Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. So glad to be with you today. One of the fundamental lessons that we talk about on this podcast and in my consulting is the simple idea that when we're anything other than human-sized, we struggle to connect. We disconnect from ourselves, from others. We are disconnected from awareness of God. The two most common moves we make as humans is when we get bigger than human-sized and when we get smaller than human-sized. When we get bigger than human-sized, we tend to kind of swell up and take up all the space where we're normally aware of others and aware of God's presence. So like by getting bigger, we don't make room for that space. When we get smaller than human-sized, we tend to move into self-protection, kind of like a turtle in its shell, where we're no longer relaxing into God's presence. Maybe another way to say it is we're no longer relaxing into God as our refuge and strength, or God as our fortress. We feel we have to protect ourselves, and thus it's hard to notice God and be connected to others. And so really the heart of this whole show is how do we be human-sized so that we can freely connect, give and receive love, just experience the God that we believe in. And one of the interesting, more advanced elements of this is anytime you're the only one of your kind in the room, things can get tricky because you're more hyper-aware of yourself and it's harder to stay human-sized. So I'm going to do a couple of things today. I'm going to light the candle and then introduce my guest because we get right into this dynamic on the episode today. Today, just a single wick candle that we light by faith that God is as close to us as the light we see in this candle, that God is as essential to us as the air in our lungs. Just a quick opportunity to relax into the presence of God. My guest today is Kadi Cole. I've had the privilege of knowing Kadi for a few years now. We actually both published our first books together, and that's how we met, is through my publisher for managing leadership anxiety. And just right away, I just realized Kadi is just one of those people that I want to learn from. She's probably most famous for her work in developing female leaders, but what's fascinating about Kadi is she doesn't just work with women. As much or more of her work is with men working with women, men and women who want to create healthy team culture in the workplace. Kadi's fascinating because her background is as a registered nurse, and then she became an executive pastor and an executive leader in a large church. She now runs her own consulting company. She travels and speaks and consults all over the world. And we got into some really interesting topics. I was so thrilled that Kadi was willing to talk about the really skewed version of power dynamics between men and women. We covered the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement. We actually dug quite a bit. I wasn't planning on it, but it's where our conversation went. I'm so glad it did, because Kadi just gave us some real gold on what's going on in those abuse situations and what we can begin to do to change it. But we started the way I started this episode now. I started by just asking Kadi to tell us about a time when she walked into the room when she was the only woman in the room, what that was like for her. Kadi, one of the things we explore on this show on Being Human is what it's like when you're the only one of your kind in a room. My teenage daughter is a Swiftie, like she's an almost militant Swiftie, and we live 3 minutes from her school. And so oftentimes at lunch, she and like 10 Swifties are in my kitchen. I'm the only middle-aged dude, and they're delightful. These young ladies are delightful, but I'm very self-conscious that I'm the only one of my kind in the room. I say that as a man, but when you're a woman and you're in an executive room, tell us about what's going on in you when you walk into a room and you're very aware I'm the only woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think all of us have that experience of feeling like we don't quite belong somewhere. Maybe it's around gender, maybe it's around age, maybe it's around belief systems or where you grew up. And so I think it's a common experience. Mine definitely, especially professionally, has a lot to do with gender. And I was thinking as we were kind of preparing for this about a time I was in a room with a bunch of executive pastors who were all men. I was the only woman there. I was new to the executive team at my church. And these were all very big, well-known churches that had a lot of multi-sites. And like, they were people that, most people in the church world would know. So it was a very intimidating crew also. So I was one of the youngest people in the room. I was the only woman in the room. And I felt very intimidated by like the scope and scale of these churches compared to where I was coming from. And I just remember that feeling of wanting to be present, wanting to be confident, wanting to belong, but at the same time feeling like everything about me did not quite fit. And it was also interesting to watch how every person treated me a little differently in that situation. I learned a lot about people and leadership in that 2 or 3 day kind of cohort meeting because of how people interacted with me. Because it was very obvious I was the one woman, but their interaction with me really changed my direction in leadership and really around this topic. So it was a very positive experience with some, very challenging with others, but it all happened in the same space.
Okay. So if somebody is the only one of their kind, particularly if they're a woman predominantly surrounded by men, how would you coach them to walk into that room being well?
I think as a believer and as someone rooted in God, it's one of the most valuable parts of our spiritual life is to reconnect with who we are in Christ and our identity in the Lord and go in with that as the main platform. Because I think when we try to build our identity out of our role or out of being enough or what we look like in other people's eyes, everything gets turned upside down. That's when our bodies start to, backfire on us. I get nervous. I want to prove myself. I overspeak or I underspeak or I question myself. But when we're really rooted in God, you put me here. You've given me these kinds of gifts. I'm going to trust that giftedness even as I walk in here. And I'm going to trust you with the outcome of this because we really are not in control of other people's view or judgment or bias of us, but we are in control of our own heart, our own peace, our own centeredness in the Lord and how we show up into those spaces. And so for me, I start with that. And then kind of rolling out of that is what has God made me to do and what do I have to offer the kingdom? I try to stay in that lane as the main way God uses me. Every once in a while, he has me kind of do something out of the norm and it's, a surprise to all of us. But I would say when I'm out of my element, for the most part, God uses me the most impactfully in the places he's given me a lot of experience and a lot of proven track record to myself. So I can speak with confidence because I know him to be true in these spaces in my life.
Yeah. And you do predominantly a lot of consulting in churches and marketplace of men and women in leadership and men and women in the workplace. But one interesting aspect of this too, Kadi, I know you've had a lot of experience with this, is when you add ethnicity and race to this same dynamic. So not just men and women, but like white men and black women, for example. What would you have for us there?
Yeah, when we start layering on different levels of minority status, so to speak, it's called intersectionality because it's not just one dynamic and two dynamics. Those dynamics actually intersect in an exponential way. And so the impact is actually more. It's like 1 + 1 = 5 for someone because now you're questioning all sorts of parts of myself. I'm not sure where I fit in culturally. I'm not sure if I can say myself this way. I think one of the shocking things to me as I started studying the research behind this and particularly how race plays into gender bias is how many women of color also change their name, also do not feel free to have a personal style that actually represents their own personal preferences or their heritage or represent themselves correctly. I didn't even really realize the impact of clothing and personal style till I had a teenage son who would not wear certain types of t-shirts because it would communicate the wrong thing about him. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, this is how I tell people I'm a skater, or this is how I tell people this is the team I like, is because I wear this. And I'm like, I kind of knew that, but for him, it was so critical. And to wear something not fully himself was almost to violate himself as he's trying to come into the world and tell people about himself. And we do that all the time, particularly women of color. The research calls it camouflaging, where we camouflage our real self to show up in a way that we think will be accepted. That takes a lot of extra energy. So you've got these high-performing leaders who are also positioning themselves as someone else, answering to a name that isn't even the given name or what they grew up with, and also trying to interject in a way that's not their natural language or cadence or pacing. it's really exhausting for people. And I think that's one of the gifts of servanthood that we as leaders, particularly white leaders or leaders in authority, that we can offer others is to take the time to learn about them. Even just been amazed at how many comments I've gotten from women particularly, or even men that I interact with that I go, is that your given name? Because you can tell this person is clearly from a different country and they're like, my name's Jeff. And I'm like, really? Is that your given name? And they're like, no, it's some name that's difficult to pronounce. And I'm like, will you teach me how to say your actual name? Or what would be an abbreviation that your parents would call you? Can I call you that? It's amazing how validating and confidence boosting that is for someone to have that culture acknowledged or their heritage acknowledged in a way that we might never even think to ask about.
My son graduated from Baylor School of Nursing in December down there in Dallas. We all went down for the ceremony. Proud moment for us. He's our first of our children to graduate college. And I was blown away. I don't remember the gentleman's role, but it wasn't just the School of Nursing. It was anybody graduating from Baylor, any school in December. There were hundreds and hundreds of graduates. And we watched this man correctly pronounce every student's name, where he must have practiced because the student would hand him a little note as they were walking across the stage, and that's their name. And so when Chinese students walked across the stage, he even used the correct tonal approach. It was really, This is a white guy. And it kind of leads me, Kadi, to your expertise. I think one of the things that makes you such a powerful speaker and consultant is you're not just equipping women, you are actually equipping men as well. Men could be listening to this conversation right now saying, well, what can I do about this? It's not my fault I'm white and majority, but actually you help us just help people feel seen. And one example was you just saying that you take that extra time to learn someone's name. Is there another thing that you would say to a guy like me that, man, if you're walking into a meeting and you see that you as the leader in the majority, someone else is in the minority, what can I as a majority person do to help that person feel seen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are many people who don't feel seen from all sorts of different backgrounds and all sorts of different roles on the team. And all of us can do this. I think if you're the leader, it's actually more on our shoulders to lead the way in it. But getting to know people personally is a huge piece of this. And you're right. I do spend the majority of my time actually working with men about how to create environments and build their teams and adjust their own personal leadership habits to be more inclusive to more leaders. We all have a lot of leaders in our congregations that are not utilizing their leadership capacity the way we would want them to in our churches or even our businesses. Getting to know people and understanding their story is one of the fastest ways to do that. So one of my best examples of this is I was working with a senior pastor team on how to sort of expand their opportunities for women. They're actually a very theologically conservative or complementarian church. So they have some limitations to where women can serve in higher level leadership roles, but they actually have a lot of roles that women could fill that they aren't feeling welcome into filling. And so they contacted me to say, what can we do? And how do we help women do this? And they tell us that they don't feel welcome. And so I just really encouraged him, even if every Sunday you just get to know one female who's in your church that you can tell is a leader. And you can tell she's a leader because, she comes in and there's kind of a presence about her and people follow her and people come up and talk to her and she goes out of her way to help other people. I'm not an advocate that every woman should be a leader, just like I don't think every guy should be a leader. There are people who are gifted in certain ways and called for certain seasons to lead. So if you see women like that seem to just, they're making movement, they're taking action, they're serving other people, just ask her a little bit about where she went to college or where's she from or, what did she ever have a job before kids? Like, well, how many kids does she have? What does she do during her day? You can ask all sorts of things. And so he was hanging out in the lobby and he saw this woman come out with a few children and he had kind of gotten to know them. They were newer to the church. He knew the husband a little better. And he's like, hey, I was thinking about you and your family. And I realized I don't know much about your story. Where did you grow up and what did you do after you graduated high school? And she went on to tell him that she went to high school, in some state, but then she went to seminary. She had been a missionary for 8 years, met her husband on the mission field, came back. They had a few children. She's a stay-at-home mom now. But all of a sudden realizing he's got this gem of a leader who's seminary trained, who's been on the mission field. She's basically volunteering in the nursery, which is a wonderful job to do, but she has a lot more that she can offer. He happened to be looking for someone to really lead their outreach program and their mission projects. And so he started talking to her about that. So now she serves as their volunteer missions director. She's activating all of her gifts. She's using her training. She's building out trips and taking people on things. It's just a beautiful story about what happens when we just go that next level to ask people about their story. We can do that on our leadership teams too. I think it's sometimes easy to assume that what we learned in the interview when we hired someone is everything we need to know from this point forward. But after that person's been on the job for a year or two, they probably have learned more things, or they're ready to activate more giftings or more opportunities in our organizations or on our team. So revisiting those conversations, learning what people are learning, what are their new passions or their new things God is opening up in their heart, and then intersecting those with the goals of the church or your organization. That's what a great leader does, sees beyond the surface and then integrates people into the calling that God has placed on your team.
That's so good. I rarely share stories on this show where I'm the hero. Unfortunately, this is one of those stories. So I'll just ask the audience to excuse that. But I think it's helpful for what we're chatting about. I was doing some work with an executive team in a pretty significant Christian publishing company. And in the executive, there's like 7 of us around a table. And we got the president and the vice president or whatever. And then one of the executives is an African-American woman. She's the only African-American woman in the room. And they've worked together for years. And I come in just to do my little couple of hours with them that I do. And I just turned to her and I said, what's it like being the only African? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm not trying to, but would you be willing to share what it's like? And she shared what it was like. It was very palpable. She loves these people. It was not tense, but she kind of shared the extra effort she has to take to be exactly herself. That was the main point. And she looked at the president, who happened to be a friend of mine. She's like, he's one of us to me. And you can't get whiter than Steve. Like, I am so white, Katie, that I'm like translucent. Like, I'm white. But her point, all it was is that I took the moment to see her. That's all it was. And it took 3 minutes. But in all those years, they'd never bothered to ask her. And so I really do think if you are majority culture, if you're in the majority in the room, there's so much you can do to help somebody be exactly themselves, so they're not having to shapeshift and camouflage and all of
absolutely.
The things you're saying.
And that's actually one of the most powerful questions for a leader who's out there that's listening and wants to get better at leading places that are welcoming to everyone on your team and all the people God might bring to you. That question is actually the most powerful question. What's it like to be a leader here? What's it like to be a female leader under my leadership? What's it like to be an African-American or a woman of color and a person who's this much older than the majority of our team? What's it like to be you on our team? Help me understand what it's like so that I can adjust my leadership to lead you better. And then the key to that, though, Steve, is that we have to really listen to the answer, not listen with our filters and our own assumptions and what my journey was like to get into leadership. Because when you're in the majority, I came from nursing, which was female majority. So my journey into nursing was pretty bump free. My journey into ministry, which is more male populated, not as bump free. And so I think even as a female leading a lot of female teams for a season of my life, asking the men on the team, what's it like to be the only guy on this floor or the only guy on the day shift? Help me understand how I can make sure this is working for you and we're getting the best of you and the best of everyone else at the same time. It's a real question of vulnerability, but if I'm not careful, I can assume your journey was a lot like mine. And I'm like, well, it couldn't have been that bad, or that's weird that you're overreacting about that. We have to really listen and ask follow-up questions to truly understand someone's experience and what they're carrying in that moment, and then adjust ourselves to that experience. That's what makes for a great team leader. That makes for a great culture. And really, everyone's probably got that story. The feedback I get the most from, especially male leaders, is, well, we deal with insecurity and we deal with imposter syndrome. And I'm like, that is absolutely true. Every leader does. Every leader has had difficulty. Every leader has had to overcome things. But until you really hear someone's story, sometimes it's easy to assume that we all have the same level of difficulty or the same kind of bumps in the road. And chances are there are some people that you could imagine have a much more challenging journey than you do.
This brings us to one of the most profound things I have personally learned from you, Kadi, is the difference in confidence between when a man is applying for a job and when a woman is applying for a job. I would love for you to share that with our folks.
Oh, yeah. This is one of my favorite pieces of research in the books. So when men or women look at opportunities for a new leadership role, they're applying for a new job, or maybe it's a promotion, or maybe if you're a church leader, it's even a volunteer opportunity in your church. They look at those opportunities very differently. So if a guy looks at a job description and if he feels confident of about 60% of what's written on the job description, he applies for the job. To be honest, he kind of figures he'll probably get it. And then once he gets the job, he's going to like Google it or talk to his dad or fake it till he makes it. But he's probably going to crush this job. That's kind of his inner conversation that he's having with himself. When a woman looks at a job description, she, generally speaking, has a very different experience. She has to feel confident of 100% of what's on that job description from the first day, or she won't even apply for the job. She won't even put her name in the hat or fill out an application. She disqualifies herself if she doesn't have a guarantee that she can be perfect from the first day. And that level of perfectionistic standards holds women back a lot. In the research, we call it the sticky floor syndrome. So you've probably heard of the stained glass ceiling, which is kind of those invisible barriers that women bump up against that would prevent them from being able to move up in leadership roles. In the church world, we call it the stained glass ceiling. But the sticky floor is kind of on the opposite end. It's the conversations and the dialogues that women have with themselves that keep their feet stuck to the floor. It keeps them from applying for a job. It keeps them from going for a promotion, even accepting a promotion. It keeps them from letting their boss know they'd like to have more responsibility or they would like to stretch and grow into a different role. And that conversation is very limiting. And it's actually one of the most powerful things we could do is to sort of address that head on with high capacity women that we see not going for opportunities or resisting applying for a job, and they might even sort of camouflage it with things like, well, I'm really busy, or I got the kids, or I've got a lot on my plate. I've not met one guy who's really busy, has kids, has a lot on his plate, not go for a promotion or not take it when offered. They all take it. Women tend to hold back because they don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to embarrass themselves. They don't want to disappoint their boss. They don't want people to find out that they're maybe not as good as they thought they were. They want to stay safe. And in that, they actually prevent themselves from growing into everything God has called them to be.
Yeah. Kadi, it feels like in 2024, we still have so much to learn about power dynamics. I remember my own journey as a lead pastor. I think I'm a big guy. I have a dominant personality, but I never felt powerful, which is really odd. And it took me too long, I think, as a lead pastor to realize, I have a lot of power. I wonder, I'd be curious your take on the Me Too movement. I feel like we saw some of this in the Me Too movement. And of course, therefore, there's also the Church Too movement. We are still seeing again and again and again men in positions of power grooming or approaching women for some kind of a sexual experience. And for some of the men, I say this without excusing them. I think they should have been exposed. I think they should be held accountable for their actions. But so in that context, we see some of the men confused because the woman in this situation, they believed gave them consent. Maybe the woman gave them consent by laughing or giggling. And these men are not appreciative of this woman is using the tools she can to get to safety. Like she's in a threat response. But because he doesn't notice his power, he just presses on. I didn't say it very cleanly, but what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money for many people. I think both men and women and how we interact with power is very confusing. I think most people feel like they're still trying to prove something, no matter how much authority they have or how high they go in an organization, or even if they start their own organization or church or nonprofit or whatever it happens to be. Most leaders are still trying to get to a place where they feel like they've achieved something or they have something to offer. That internal insecurity is driving them. And so sometimes it's easy to not stop and look around and be like, I actually have a lot of authority here. Like, I don't recognize it. When you overlay that with Christian values and sort of our resistance against power in our culture, we don't talk about power a lot. We tend to have judgment against power. We really focus on humility, which is a godly character, but sometimes you can feign humility because you can not talk about how much power you have or not acknowledge it, but you still are using it for your own gain. So I think what ends up happening in some of these power dynamics, it's particularly ugly when we see it in male, female power, sexuality kinds of dynamics in workplaces or churches where there's spiritual authority at play, is that it is easy, I think, for people to fall into the gap of not realizing the power of their words or the power of their authority. I remember as a young executive leader in my church, we had several multi-sites that I oversaw, and I would go visit different campuses. And I remember walking through a campus one time, and I was just on my way to a meeting, so I was kind of in a hurry, and the receptionist stopped me, and she said, "Hey, Katie, what do you think about this new picture we just hung up in the reception?" And I was like, "It's great." And I moved on because I'm just trying to be an encourager and whatever. 18 months later, I get a call from the campus pastor, and we were in the middle of a big remodel and build out project at his campus. And he's like, "Katie, help me understand why you love this picture so much. Do we have to keep it in the lobby?" And I'm like, "What picture are you talking about?" He sent me a picture of it. And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I know exactly where this came from." That receptionist communicated that I adore this picture and we cannot take it down even in the middle of this huge remodeling project. And it was such a great lesson to me because I didn't realize the power of my words. Even a simple thumbs up approval on something I didn't even care about had ripple effects. We do that with power all the time. Parents fall into this gap a lot too. They say something under their breath. They make a sarcastic joke to their kid. Those things stay in a kid's heart, not because of what we said, but who said it. And many male leaders, I've talked to them because we walk through churches with moral failings all the time. I feel like we're still getting headlines of high profile leaders even recently, that are just breaking my heart.
Yeah.
Breaking it. And I know, because I've been through enough of them, where especially the man who is in power is saying, "I didn't really realize," or "I feel like she's changing her tune," or "That's not what happened. She was consensual." And she's saying, "Well, I mean, I didn't like totally object, but I wasn't really into it, and I wasn't sure." And power dynamic matters. And our power is our responsibility. And to shy away from it or not acknowledge it or to misuse it is really to not only not steward, but actually cause harm in our leadership. And so I think that's part of what we have to continue to bring awareness about. It's also part of what we have to educate women about, that power is not permission, and having those safe places for women to go when they are feeling uncomfortable, when they are feeling pressure. And also, to be honest, Steve, especially in church world, we do not have a great place for men to go when they are feeling tempted or when they do struggle with something. I mean, a lot of these issues we're seeing are decades old, or they've been propagated and hidden by other leaders instead of brought into the open and confessed and dealt with and reestablished and healed, right? And then evaluated whether restoration is even reasonable. Instead, we kind of move into restoration. We're worried about honoring people's careers or protecting their family, and instead we're covering sin. And it is coming back to bite us every month. I feel like we are having someone that we're like, "Man, this did not get taken care of in the early days when it could have, and now we're paying the price with interest, and all of us are suffering because of it."
Yeah, I'm so glad I asked. I'm so grateful for what you shared, because I think it is surprising how far we still have to go. And I do think this is a lot of the fundamental issue is a misunderstanding of power. And I've not heard someone answer it the way you did, Katie. I have asked this sort of question to a number of people, but you are the first one to bring up the insecurity of a powerful leader. And that would surprise a lot of people, but that really rang true with me. Particularly, I too have been involved in some of these situations. They're awful. And it is commonly a very powerful leader with profoundly unaddressed childhood wounds. Again, that does not excuse but they can't. Somewhere along the way, they stopped managing it. They put it in a lockbox, and of course, it came out. And now these women are paying tremendously. Oftentimes, the leader and the board demonize the women instead of believe them. Like there's that secondary trauma that happens where, like, what is going on where the board is protecting the perpetrator and demonizing the victim? But even that has become kind of a cliche.
100%. Well, and I think especially in church, it gets complicated because we hold our spiritual leaders to such high esteem. And many of us have spent years, if not decades, sacrificing, following, giving our resources of time, money. We stewarded our children under their pastoral leadership. We've submitted to things that we didn't even agree with out of honor and respect for that role. And when we are confronted with truth about something that is almost inconceivable of someone you've held in that kind of esteem, it is a mind bender to get your head around it. I will admit for myself that we've had a couple major leaders fall that were significant role models for me. Like, I spent decades going to their conferences. I read every one of their books. They're on my wish list to meet one day. And I watched them fall. And it took me longer than it should have to get my head around that one. But it was inconceivable for me that this person I trusted and looked to I was like, there's gotta be a different answer. There's gotta be a different way. Right. And I'm like, this is like what I do. And even in my own heart, it just could not reconcile. It's similar to, you're talking about your new book coming up, of just, when we have this image of God and his leaders and we want it to be true, man, it is so hard when those things are challenged. And a lot of times it takes us too long and we don't process it clearly enough, and we're not in tune enough with the humanness of leaders to be able to accept it. And a lot of that is because many times we abdicate our own leadership to these human leaders instead of abdicating our leadership to God. We've got someone in the flesh. We want their approval. So we follow them in a way that really is designed to only follow the Lord in.
Yeah. In the fall, we're doing a whole series on this show about the secondhand damage of abuse.
Oh, wow. That's
we're
interviewing
powerful. A spouse of one of these leaders, the best friend of one of these leaders. We're interviewing somebody, won't name name. The names will come out in the fall, but interviewing somebody who, this famous person died, people critiqued him, this person defended him, and then later discovered the truth and had to publicly.
Yeah,
it's challenging, and it goes a little beyond the scope of what we were going to chat about today, but it's also heartbreaking that somehow some of those leaders don't believe they can repent. They can only go into hiding with their lawyers, and so somehow they don't realize that the gospel's available to them too. It's really tragic.
Well, and I think when you're in full-time ministry particularly, and you've interwoven your career with your walk with the Lord, and those feel like the same thing, what I see is it's easy for leaders to slowly disconnect from the Lord and connect deeper into leadership. And my experience has been, I don't know what yours is, Steve, but absolutely, I have found absolutely zero relationship between the health of a leader and the health and growth of their church. I've seen really wildly growing churches where we find out later the leader was incredibly toxic. I've found really stagnant churches where they're trying desperately to strategize and move their growth, plan forward, but their pastor is heart of gold. And I'm like, why is God not blessing this guy with growth and ministry expansion, but that guy that we all know is like not a good person? Why is that the thing that's growing? It's very confusing, and but there's no relationship. And so I think sometimes when we see things grow, we assume great spirituality. What we're really seeing is great systems and great organizational leadership. And the more someone leans into that, and especially if they disconnect from God, what ends up happening is when these issues are confronted, they lean into the leadership side because they've been operating in that for 20 or 30 years. They are far removed from those spiritual practices of daily confession. If you're still confessing every day and something big comes up, guess what? You go to confession. If you haven't confessed consistently in 20 years, guess what? Confession takes a long time to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complicated. I'm often brought in to look under the hood, or, for my precious listeners from the motherland, under the bonnet. Um, we just asked 3 simple questions. I'll share them in case this is helpful for folks. The first question is, who's generating the anxiety? The second question is, who's carrying it? And those that are carrying it, what adjustments are they making to keep everything stable? So what I tend to see is the external results are growth, but actually for years and years, there has been a group around the toxic leader who knows that person's toxic. Maybe they don't know to the extent. Commonly, they don't know the extent, but something was off. And then this group just adjusted themselves and shape-shifted like a chameleon in the name of, for the sake of the kingdom. So one of the things I'll be working on in the future is helping us figure out what is healthy shadow side and what is destructive shadow side, because every leader has a shadow side. Like none of us are perfect, but there is a line between, oh, well, that's just Steve, and, oh, that's just Steve, let's call the police, or let's have an early intervention, because it's not good. I feel like I'm ranting a little here, Katie, but it's not good for the perpetrator to get away with it. Mm-hmm. But in the church, we don't know how to confront somebody in power. And so I spend a lot of my time convincing executive leaders, like it's actually in his best interest that you hold his feet to the fire, because he's gonna burn himself and burn everybody. So yeah, my experience is, yes, on the outward sign, lots of growth and health, but once you get to the inner circle, you see a lot of toxicity, I think, that's been going on for a long time.
Well, and I think it's easy, like any sort of unhealthy relationship, it doesn't start out super unhealthy, and sin doesn't start out big. Right. It usually starts out small. And so it's that kind of like frog in boiling water, even when you're one of the enablers. And it just feels like a little micro step every week over years really adds up. But I love that you're going to work on that, because I think even knowing the difference between what's sin versus just weakness, what's toxic versus just normal, healthy, unhealthy, like where are those lines? And then what do we do when we find those lines? One of my really good friends, Pastor Jeff Bogue, he told me one time when we had a crisis kind of going on in one of my teams, he said, the thing you have to remember, Katie, is that when sin is hidden, Satan has been given control. But when sin is exposed, God is at work, because only God exposes sin. And that helped me so much reorient my life around it, because I think there are many of us who are protectors. It's one of the reasons we get called into church ministry, because pastoring is shepherding. It's a protective role, and we want to care for and nurture and protect the flock. That's one of the key kind of roles of leaders in the church. What happens is when we protect our leaders, though, or we protect the church or God from exposing sin, we're doing God's job for him. And I think when Jeff sort of said that phrase to me, I was like, oh my gosh, sometimes the most protective thing I can do for the church is to expose sin, because that's the action that God does. When I hide it, or when I keep it secret, or when I feel like God needs me to protect his church from exposing sin, I'm in the wrong role. I'm taking the Holy Spirit's role instead of my role as an obedient follower who's supposed to do God's will in this situation.
So Katie, you're fascinating, because your initial training was as a nurse. You're an RN. And I've told you offline, I have this kind of unofficial rule of church leadership that I should always have at least one nurse on my staff. So quick shout out to Nancy and Katie. But also, this is a great chance for me to shout out to my all-time favorite nurse in the world, my oldest son, Bryson, rocking it there in Waxahachie.
Love it.
But Katie, my experience with nurses is you just have a unique training and worldview that serves executive leadership so well. What is it in your opinion?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. So the way I describe nursing versus maybe medicine, they're two different professions for a reason. They have very different models of the way we think about things. So medicine is really oriented towards diseases, and they treat disease. And I'm grateful for it. I love modern medicine. I'm very grateful for doctors. I go to mine all the time. I highly recommend them. Nursing, on the other hand, is very patient focused. And so their goal is to create wellness around the patient in all of the aspects of their life. So their goal is to implement treatments from the doctor to bring about wellness, which means when I'm taking care of a patient, I do care about the medicine they're supposed to get. I'm also checking vital signs. I'm also asking them questions like, how are you doing today? Who's picking you up from the hospital? Do you have a wheelchair at home? Who brings you food? What kind of friends do you have? I'm looking at all of the aspects of wellness: financial, emotional, spiritual, physical, financial. I want all of those aspects in healthy places, because if any one of those aren't working, wellness really isn't possible for this person. And that's my goal. The other thing that happens in nursing is we carry a lot of relational capacity. We learn a lot about like therapeutic use of self, because you have to be able to disarm people in order to give them a painful shot, right? And so nurses have that unique combination of, let me talk to you and distract you and engage you and actually authentically care about you as I'm about to inject you this medicine that you're going to be mad at me for, but I'm going to make you better. And that combination of kind of being able to rip the Band-Aid or give the shot and at the same time communicate care and love and authenticity is, I think, unique to nurses and is also unique to highly effective executive leaders, right? I care about you as a person. I care about the calling God has in your life. I see greatness in you. And I also need you to stop doing these three things. And I need you to tighten that up or we're going to have some bigger problems. But I also look at you from a holistic viewpoint. So when you walk into work and I can tell something's up, I actually need to know what that is, because maybe I can help you and that's going to help you perform better. So very holistic, and then not afraid to be painful and loving at the same time.
Wonderful. You're launching this whole new initiative, which is such a colossal gap in the church. Tell us about what you're doing with young people in marketplace leadership.
Yes, thank you for asking. I'm very excited about this. So one of the things I'm very passionate about, it's one of the reasons I advocate for women leaders all the time, is I have a strong sensitivity to people I feel like belong leading in the kingdom, but haven't found their place. Or somehow in our current church model or the way we're practicing church leadership, we're excluding people accidentally. I would say when I look at the next generation, female leaders is not my biggest concern. I think it's people who are not called into full-time ministry. So when we, work with young people, or I'm at a conference and we're calling people into careers of full-time vocational ministry, we usually see about 10% of the students feel some sort of call towards that. That's kind of a general number. I love that. And a lot of churches have great programs to help you explore ministry and do internships and be a high school apprentice and go to school and seminary, all these things. But the other 90% of the kids, we almost do nothing for. And what has happened over the last couple decades is that I think we've given some really unintentional negative messages to the other 90% of young adults and young leaders, our future leaders, where they get messages that say things like, your real job is just earn as much money to give to the church to have the real people who do ministry work in ministry, right? There's this sense that we just want you for your money. Or you don't love Jesus as much. If you did, you would go into ministry. You wouldn't be a nurse or a businessman or start your own company. Or a lot of times I meet more mature marketplace leaders and they feel guilty that somehow they should have done something different or chosen something with more kingdom impact. We have a lot of kind of mentoring programs for especially Christian business leaders, but they're all happening in nonprofits or all happening in people's boardrooms outside the church. We really wanted to come together and bring a program that would actually strengthen and increase engagement for both young leaders and marketplace leaders in a local church. So we've been piloting it for the last 2 years and are now launching it publicly right now. But it's basically a 2-semester program for high schoolers and young adults to be connected with a local church's marketplace leaders. So we stick those people in with young leaders and walk them through 16 weeks over 2 semesters of curriculum around theology, around career readiness skills that line up with spiritual formation. So we've had incredible success in the first couple of years. I'm really excited about it. And if anyone wants to come and talk to me about it, please let me know. I would love to have a conversation about it.
Well, Kadi Cole, you have spoken and done keynotes on stages in front of thousands of people. You have led and been an essential part of a church that grew to over 20,000. You've run a $50 million budget. You have taken a stick and put it in someone's mouth and told them to say, ah. However, you have not yet successfully endured the being human gauntlet of anxiety questions. So without further ado, I think we'll just do 5 questions here. We'll go rapid fire. Let me just find a few questions here off my list. All right, number 1, how do you know when you're not well?
Oh gosh. Well, my first thing is I always want ice cream for dinner. So I tend to go to food when I'm feeling very stressed. And then I ruminate on stuff for a long time. And I know I'm not doing well when I'm doing more ruminating than praying. And it took me a long time to figure out that those are two different things.
Good. Okay. When you think about your family of origin, what's one asset and one liability that you've inherited from your family of origin?
Oh gosh. Well, my dad was a pilot in the Navy, so he was a commander and very strong leader, very quick wit, very sharp-minded, very strategic. I love those aspects of him. I'm not as fond of the sharp wit when it's directed without a good heart, or the quick to jump to assumptions about people.
Okay. Tell us about this question from my listeners, a little more convoluted, but when has your attempted solution to a problem actually made the problem worse or kept it the same?
Actually, the one that comes to mind is when I was in my first job in ministry. I'd been recruited by my church out of nursing to come and help sort of give some structure to our worship team because I had a background in musical theater and I could do production really well. And I remember it was very disorganized and I have a strong administrative gift. And so I'm like, I am going to so help these creative people get themselves organized. I brought my spreadsheets. I color coded it. I had everybody on a schedule. We started planning Christmas in July. I was going to make this all happen. And I absolutely administrated the creative juices out of every single person on the team. And they were about ready to quit or revolt or do something. But my solution of organization and sort of structure was actually the last thing they needed. And so I learned a really great lesson of servant leadership in that sometimes my gift, although it can be great, can also be very harmful.
That's such a great answer. When you think about relaxing into the presence of God, what's a habit or a practice or a person that you know that helps you relax into God's presence?
I'm very committed to my morning quiet time. I probably have a couple hour morning routine that I do. I don't spend all of that in quiet time, but for me, my mornings are very sacred for me. So I go for a sunrise walk almost every morning. I live in South Florida, so I can do that most of the year. And that tends to really center me. I think I've memorized a whole series of scriptures that have to do with God's presence or new grace or, his mercies being new every morning. And so I recite a lot of those and just try to breathe in his beautiful artistry every morning. That I find that very centering and a really key element to me starting my day. Even when I travel, I usually get up and at least go to a window and watch the sunrise every morning and take a few minutes. I've just found it to be incredibly helpful.
And Kadi, the last question is, when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
Well, I have a 20-year-old son and he's away at college now and he's not much of a chatter or a texter, especially with me. So when he comes home or calls me spontaneously and it's not an emergency need, but he literally is just calling to tell me something wonderful that happened, I feel so appreciated and loved and fully at peace that he is well and he's excited enough about his life to call and tell me about it.
My guest is Kadi Cole. She's the author of many books, most probably well known for developing female leaders. It is the book to get for men and women on healthy workplace culture. Kadi, thank you so much for coming on Being Human.
Well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate all of your leadership and ministry. Thanks for having me here.